We are already inserting and reading from the database, and for that, we have been using a SQLite connection. With this connection, we have mentioned that has to be closed every single time that we use it, after we've finished using it, because there can only be one connection at a time. And we have mentioned that not closing this connection can create issues if we want to create another connection to the same database and there is already a connection being established before. So it is absolutely necessary for us to remember to close the connection by calling the close method. But during this lecture, we're going to talk about using statements, not to be confused with using directives, which are the ones that we use to add a reference to a certain namespace. A using statement will allow us to not have to worry about closing a connection. More specific, a using statement is going to allow us to call automatically the dispose method from an iDisposable interface. Now we have talked about interfaces and we know a little bit about how they work. And it turns out that the SQLite connection implements an interface that allows us to use a using statement. We can take a look at that by right-clicking on the class and selecting Go to Definition. This will open the file where the class is being defined. And notice that in fact, it is implementing the iDisposable interface. And in the iDisposable interface, there is a dispose method that was defined. This dispose method is going to do something very similar to what we are currently doing with the close method. And it doesn't mean that we have to call the dispose method instead of the close method. It means that there is another notation that can spare us the trouble of remembering to call the close method. The syntax that I'm talking about is the using statement. And contrary to using directives, it is used directly into our code. In here, I am going to define a using, and I am going to define in parentheses what it is that I'm going to be using, like this. And then this using statement is going to have body, and inside of the body is where I want to have the other two lines of code that I've been using. What the using statement is going to do is that the variable that is being defined inside of the using statement is only going to exist within this scope. And that is fine because normally when we define a variable inside one scope, it doesn't exist outside of that scope. But what the using statement is also doing is as soon as the execution leaves this block of code, the dispose method is going to be automatically called. And so the connection won't no longer exist. It would be just as if the close method had been called. So we can be certain that we can create new connections without having to worry about this. So in here, I have changed the definition when I'm reading from the database, but it's also important to do it where I'm inserting into the database. So inside the new travel page, what I want to do is grab this SQLite connection definition inside of a using statement. Remember that this has to be inside of parentheses, and it's going to have its body. And now we do not need the close call. And just like this, we are making sure that we are always going to have only one connection. By the way, since I'm defining the rows inside of that scope, I am going to maintain these evaluations inside of the using statement. And so whenever the execution leaves this code, the connection will be disposed, the connection will be closed, and we would be able to create new connections without any problem and without having to call the close method. This has been a quick look at the iDisposable interface and the using statements. I suggest that from now on you always use using statements when creating SQLite connections to your databases, instead of having to remember to call the close methods. In the next lecture, we're going to start to talk about how are we going to make the list that we are already reading from the database display inside of the interface. And we're going to start by talking about data binding, what is it, and how is it going to help us link this list to our SAML files.